Everyone in the Driscoll Hotel ballroom laughed when the cater-waiter smashed the Mafia Bosses' blue velvet ring box against the marble table. 300 guests in tailored tuxedos and diamonds turned to stare, champagne untouched in their hands, a string quartet cutting off mid-note. They saw a thin young woman in a black serving uniform that still smelled of the kitchen, her brown hair coming loose, her knuckles raw from 100 carried trays. Her name was Cassie Holloway, 27 years old, a girl from Chicago's South Side who buried her mother 2 years ago, and now raised a 9-year-old brother with asthma on a paycheck that never stretched far enough. She wasn't supposed to be noticed at all. Waiters never are. And on the other side of the aisle stood Tommaso Falconetti, 37, the man who controlled the shipping docks and the quiet gambling rooms along the Great Lakes. He hadn't removed his long black coat despite the heat of the room. A faint scar traced his jaw. 2 bodyguards waited behind him like doors that could walk. He was a man people learned to fear before they learned his name, a man who'd buried a 6-year-old daughter and never let anyone speak of her since. His bride, Bianca Coletti, beautiful and sharp in white silk, laughed first and loudest. "The girl who carries plates," she said, "now thinks she can stop a wedding." But Cassie didn't give the box back. She turned it over, and beneath the velvet lining she pulled a small internal order card the catering company always clipped to special items. She lifted it high enough for the groom to see. "This isn't a ring box," she said, her voice steady in the silence. "This came from a child's memorial order, and the person who chose it knew exactly whose child it was." Tommaso Falconetti went completely still. Because the date printed on that card was the same date he'd lost his daughter. Because the things he'd forbidden anyone to touch had all quietly reappeared tonight, one by one. And because for the first time in 2 years, someone had looked at his grief and refused to let it be used as a leash. Why would a powerful man's own wedding be built around the one wound he never allowed anyone to name? Who turned a dead child's keepsake into a trophy? And why was a tired waitress the only person in 300 who noticed? Before you go any further, if stories about courage, dignity, and the truth nobody else dares to say mean something to you, hit that like button right now. Share this video with someone who believes ordinary people can still change everything. And subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one. Now let's go back to the beginning. To the night a poor waitress learned that the table never lies, and a dangerous man learned that being seen is its own kind of mercy. A week before the night in the grand lobby of the Driscoll Hotel, Cassie Holloway's life was contained within only 3 things: a run-down apartment, a sick little brother, and a stack of bills thicker than the notebook she had once used during her pastry apprenticeship. The apartment sat on the 3rd floor of an old red brick building on the south side of Chicago, where winter slipped through the window cracks like cold fingers, and the bathroom ceiling had a brown stain that grew a little larger every time it rained. She placed a bucket directly beneath that stain. The sound of water dripping into the bucket at midnight was a sound she had grown so used to that she no longer heard it. What she always heard was Toby's breathing. The boy was 9 years old, thin and frail, with big eyes and far too many questions, and he slept in the only room with a door, while Cassie slept on the worn fabric sofa. Every night, she listened to her brother's breathing through the thin wall, and whenever that breathing turned wheezy and rushed, she was on her feet before she was even fully awake. On Tuesday night that week, Toby's asthma attack came close to 2 o'clock in the morning. Cassie heard the dry coughing, then the long, strained whistle, as though someone were choking the breath out of a small horn. She rushed into the room, turned on the light, and searched for the inhaler in the drawer. She had counted the doses left since the week before. 4. Now there were only 3. She placed the inhaler in his hand, one hand rubbing his back, keeping her voice as calm as she could even though her heart was pounding like a war drum. "Breathe out first, then breathe in," she said, "just like we practiced." Toby nodded, his eyes wet, and after several long endless minutes, the small cage of his chest finally eased. Cassie sat on the edge of the bed until he fell asleep again. Then she stepped out into the living room and opened the tin box of mail on top of the refrigerator. Inside were envelopes she no longer dared to open too quickly. Her mother's hospital bills. Her mother had died 2 years earlier of cancer, and that illness hadn't only taken away the woman who had raised the 2 siblings alone, it had left behind a number, $41,000. That number was printed on the paper with such cold indifference, as though a human life could be converted into neat lines on a statement. Cassie had been paying it down little by little, 1 month 100, the next month 200, and the number still barely moved, because the interest devoured the principal faster than she could earn. She worked as a seasonal server for Halcyon Events, a high-end catering and event company that handled weddings and galas, where the price of a single floral centerpiece equaled an entire month of her rent. Her shifts usually began in the late afternoon and ended when the city had already gone to sleep. She carried trays, poured wine, cleared plates, and she did it so well that she became almost invisible, exactly the way people expected a server to be. But that invisibility had taught her something she had never told anyone. Cassie believed a dining table never lied. People did. They smiled at one another over glasses of champagne, then turned away with eyes gone cold. They praised the food while pushing it to the edge of the plate. But a table was honest. A married couple on the edge of divorce sat a few inches farther apart than usual. A man about to go bankrupt drank faster and laughed louder than necessary. Someone hiding fear would touch a water glass again and again without truly drinking from it. Cassie read those things the way other people read words, not because she was curious, but because when people thought you didn't exist, they forgot to hide. Her mother used to say, "The way people treat you when they think you don't matter, that's who they really are." Cassie had never forgotten it. She locked the tin box, set it back in its place on top of the refrigerator, and looked at the clock. There were 3 hours left before dawn, 3 hours before she had to get up, take Toby to school, then catch 2 buses to Halcyon's warehouse to pick up the new weekly schedule. She didn't know that schedule, the thin sheet of paper she would lift the next morning with a hand still cold, held within it a name that would change everything, a name the entire city spoke in whispers, a family, a wedding, and a contract large enough to save her from the stack of bills inside the tin box, or sink her deeper than anything she had ever imagined. The next morning, the Halcyon Events warehouse was as cold as a freezer and reeked of burnt coffee from the pot that was always left sitting too long. Cassie arrived 15 minutes early, as usual, and stood in line with the other servers in front of the shift board hanging on the brick wall. That was when Maggie Dolan found her. Maggie was 3 years older than Cassie, with red hair tied back in a hurry, a mouth always ready with a joke, and hands that had carried trays for so long she claimed she could balance 6 glasses of wine during an earthquake. The two of them had worked together for nearly 2 years, long enough for Maggie to become the closest thing Cassie had to family besides Toby. "Guess who just won the lottery without buying a ticket?" Maggie said, pressing the warehouse's terrible coffee into her hand. Cassie looked up at the board and saw her name beneath a bold printed line that seemed to make the whole room sink slightly. Falconetti, Wedding, Driscoll Hotel. She knew that name. The whole city knew it, though almost no one said it out loud. It was the family name people lowered their voices to mention, the name tied to docks, warehouses that shut their doors at midnight, and back rooms where money changed hands with no one counting in front of strangers. Maggie shrugged as though she could read Cassie's thoughts. "Their money's still green like everybody else's," she said, "and from what I hear, this time it's a much deeper green." The shift manager, a man named Pruitt, whose glasses were always sliding down the bridge of his nose, called Cassie over and handed her the temporary contract, along with the pay rate for the event. Cassie read the number twice, then she read it a third time, because the first time she thought she had seen it wrong. 1 single night of service, plus the rehearsals, paid almost 5 times as much as a normal shift, with the promise that if everything went smoothly, Halcyon would keep her on the permanent service team for high-profile events year-round. In Cassie's mind, that number immediately became other things. 4 doses for Toby's inhaler. 1 month of rent she wouldn't have to beg for more time to pay. A payment toward the tin box on top of the refrigerator, large enough for the principal to truly move for the first time. She signed her name while her hand was still cold. "Don't look at that paper like it's about to bite you," Maggie said, though she herself was smiling in a tense sort of way. Rich people getting married still need somebody to pour the wine. That afternoon, Pruitt handed each person on the team an unusually thick instruction packet, printed on white paper embossed with the family name in the corner. Cassie flipped through the pages of rules about uniforms, staff pathways, the wine list, the seating chart, and then she stopped at a page near the end marked in red ink. with a heading that clearly listed the things absolutely forbidden from appearing at the event. She had read plenty of lists like this before: brides allergic to peanuts, guests who didn't eat meat, mothers-in-law who hated lilies. But this list was different. No tiered wedding cake, the first line read. No blue velvet ring box. No clair de lune under any circumstances, including background music or string quartet arrangements. Cassie read those 3 lines twice. There was something about them that made her pause. Not because they were strange, but because they were too specific. People didn't forbid something unless it had once meant something to someone. And people didn't put it in writing, printed boldly in red ink, unless they were afraid someone would deliberately violate it. She handed the page to Maggie to see. Maggie skimmed it, then snorted. Rich people and their drama, she said. Maybe the boss is allergic to frosting. But Cassie didn't laugh with her. She looked at the 3 red lines for a moment longer, memorizing them the way her hands remembered the weight of a full tray, then folded the packet and slipped it into her bag. She didn't know why yet, but the instinct sharpened by hundreds of dinner tables was sending up the smallest warning inside her. The signal she always recognized whenever an event was about to unfold into something nothing like the face it showed the world. The first rehearsal was 3 days away, and Cassie would walk into the Driscoll Hotel without knowing that those 3 lines of red ink were the first thread of a net that had been stretched long before she ever arrived. The Driscoll Hotel was beautiful in the kind of way that made people lower their voices when they stepped inside, with soaring ceilings, marble columns veined like clouds, and a grand staircase curving up to the 2nd floor like the neck of a swan. Cassie arrived early for the rehearsal, wearing the cleanest black uniform she owned, and immediately realized that this wedding was unlike any event she had ever served. Not because of the luxury, though there was more than enough of that, but because of the way the men stood in the corners of the room. They weren't guests. They weren't holding glasses, weren't talking, weren't looking at their phones. They simply stood there, backs straight, hands resting at their sides, while their eyes moved across the room in a steady rhythm Cassie had seen before in airport security officers, except these men wore no badges, and no one dared ask their names. Maggie leaned close to her ear and whispered that she had counted 6 of them in the main lobby alone, and that didn't include the ones she couldn't see. The air in the room carried a heavy elegance, the kind of elegance that smelled of old money and something colder underneath, like a thin sheet of ice stretched over a deep lake. Cassie was assigned to stand with the service team along the east wall, practicing their movement around the seating chart, learning the route from the kitchen to the lobby, so that not a single server would cross the central aisle. It was while she was memorizing those paths that the room subtly changed. No one made an announcement. There was no applause. But Cassie felt it in the way the men in the corners all stood a little straighter at once, in the way every voice in the room automatically dropped by half a note. She looked up and saw the man entering through the north door. He walked slowly, without haste, with the stride of someone who had never had to step aside for anyone. Cassie was too far away to see his face clearly, but she didn't need to see his face clearly to understand who she was looking at. The entire room had spoken for him. The coordinator holding the clipboard immediately ended the conversation she had been having. A wine server standing near the main aisle moved back half a step, perhaps without even realizing it himself. Even Pruitt, the shift manager with glasses that were always sliding down, suddenly went still as though afraid one wrong movement might be remembered. Cassie watched as the man stopped in the middle of the lobby and looked around, not like a groom admiring the place where his wedding would be held, but like a man checking how many exits there were and who was standing closest to each one. He didn't smile. He didn't shake anyone's hand. When the coordinator stepped forward to ask him something about the arrangement, he answered with only a few short words, and the woman nodded again and again as though every word were in order. Cassie noticed that no one touched him. There was always an invisible space kept around him of about 1 foot, a buffer the crowd created automatically for people whom instinct warned them not to approach too closely. She had seen wealth at dinner tables before, and wealth was usually loud, eager to be admired, eager to tell its own story. But this man carried something else. His power was silent, and that silence frightened people more than any threat could have. Maggie leaned close again, and this time there was no teasing in her voice. "Don't look too long," she whispered. "Men like that can feel it when someone's watching them." Cassie turned her face away, pretending to adjust the stack of napkins on the side table, but in the last instant before she looked away, she saw the man raise a hand to stop another server who was about to place a vase of flowers on the ceremonial table in the middle of the lobby. He didn't say anything loudly. He only gave one slight shake of his head, and the server immediately lifted the vase away, as though he had nearly violated something sacred. Cassie looked at that empty ceremonial table, the table everyone seemed to understand without being told to hold nothing unless permission had been given, and in her mind the 3 red lines from the packet quietly echoed again. There was something inside this man that was guarded so carefully, even a vase of flowers in the wrong place could touch it. And Cassie, though she didn't yet know why, began to feel that the forbidden things in that packet weren't wedding rules. They were the scars of a human being. The man left the lobby after only 10 minutes, and the moment he disappeared behind the north door, the entire room breathed out like a lung finally allowed to expand again. That was when the bride appeared. Bianca Coletti came down the grand staircase with the walk of a woman who knew every eye was on her and enjoyed every second of it. She was beautiful in a sharp-edged way, with high cheekbones, black hair pinned into a flawless bun without a single loose strand, and a smile always ready on her lips but never reaching her eyes. If that man carried silent power, then Bianca carried the kind of power that liked to be heard. She clapped her hands twice, summoned the coordinator, and began moving around the lobby, handing out orders in a voice so sweet that it took Cassie a moment to realize each gentle sentence was actually a whip. Cassie was rearranging glasses on the side table when Bianca stopped beside the ceremonial table in the middle of the lobby, the very table the man had stopped them from placing flowers on. A young assistant brought her a ring box for approval, wrapped in charcoal gray velvet, simple and elegant. Bianca looked at it as though she were looking at a dead animal. "I made it clear that I wanted blue," she said, her voice still sweet but several degrees colder. The assistant stammered that the preparation team had been strictly instructed to avoid blue velvet ring boxes, that it was on the list of forbidden items. Bianca tilted her head slightly, and her smile widened in a way that made Cassie's skin prickle. "That list was forced upon us by Tommaso," she said. "But I am the bride today, and I've changed my mind. Bring me the blue velvet box." The assistant looked around as if searching for someone to save her, but no one in the lobby dared to speak. Cassie lowered her head toward the stack of glasses in front of her, but her ears had gone taut, and in her mind, the 3 red lines appeared as clearly as if they were printed before her. The second lines stating no blue velvet ring box. She had just witnessed someone deliberately order a violation of the very thing that had been printed in bold as a warning, and she had done it not by accident, but with a calmness that made Cassie believe she knew exactly what she was doing. Just then, a man separated himself from the coordination group and approached Bianca. He was around 40 years old, wearing a well-fitted gray suit and a name tag that identified him as an event manager. But something about him didn't match that tag. Cassie had worked with dozens of event managers, and they were always rushing, always holding clipboards, always speaking to 5 people at once. This man was different. He moved slowly, watched more than he directed, and when he spoke to Bianca, the two of them leaned their heads close in the manner of people accustomed to discussing private matters. Cassie caught fragments that told her his name was Elias Vance. He told Bianca that the original prop vendor, the one Halcyon had used for years, would be replaced by another vendor specifically for the items on the ceremonial table, and that this change needed to be made during the final rehearsal, as close to the ceremony as possible, so no one would have time to cross-check it. Bianca only nodded, as though it had already been agreed upon. Cassie didn't understand everything, but she understood enough to feel a chill run down her spine. In her line of work, vendors were changed at the last minute for 2 reasons, either because the old vendor had ruined something, or because someone wanted an item slipped into the event without going through the usual inspection. And deliberately pushing that change to the moment closest to the ceremony served only the second reason. Maggie passed by with a tray of empty glasses, leaning toward Cassie to toss out a joke about the bride being more difficult than her future mother-in-law. But Cassie barely heard her. She was watching Elias Vance leave Bianca, and quietly take pictures of the empty ceremonial table with his phone, not one picture, but several. from multiple angles like a man measuring for something soon to be placed in that exact spot. The instinct Cassie had sharpened over hundreds of dinner tables was no longer sending a faint twinge. It was ringing clearly now, like a bell, and she knew with cold certainty that she needed to stay after the rehearsal to see what that table would finally receive. On the night before the wedding, after the final rehearsal ended and most of the staff had gone home, Cassie found an excuse to stay behind. She told Pruitt she wanted to inventory the crystal glasses and silverware for her section of the reception, so nothing would be missing the next morning. And because Cassie was known for being careful, he only nodded wearily and handed her the key to the auxiliary storage area, telling her to lock the door when she was done. The storage area was behind the kitchen, a row of cold rooms and tall metal shelves stacked with prop boxes, each box labeled with a barcode printed with the internal scale halcyon, used to track every item going in and out of an event. Cassie understood that system better than anyone, because for 2 years she had scanned thousands of those codes whenever she checked items in and out. Each SKU didn't only identify what an item was, it also recorded the original order, the vendor, and the type of event the item had been reserved for. She started with the familiar boxes, glasses, plates, linens, exactly as she had told Pruitt, but her hands did the work almost unconsciously while her eyes searched for something else. She was looking for the boxes meant for the ceremonial table, the items Elias Vance had arranged to change vendors for at the last minute. It took her nearly an hour to find them, set apart in the farthest corner of the cold room, 3 small boxes that didn't carry the familiar Halcyon label, but instead bore the label of a vendor she had never heard of. Cassie took the handheld scanner used for inventory and aimed its red beam at the barcode on the first box. The small screen lit up, and the line of information that appeared made her freeze. This SKU didn't match any wedding catalog. She scanned it again, thinking the device had misread it, but the result was the same. She opened the box. Inside, nestled in white tissue paper, was the ring box wrapped in blue velvet, the exact shade Bianca had ordered them to switch to, the exact object listed in the red ink as strictly forbidden. Cassie picked it up. It was heavier than she had expected, the velvet soft and smooth beneath her calloused fingers. She turned the box over to look for the second SKU. The smaller code vendors always placed on the bottom of each individual item for source tracking, and when she scanned it, her breath seemed to freeze inside her chest. The screen displayed an order code, and beside that order code was the type of event the box had originally been reserved for. Not a wedding, not an engagement, not any kind of celebration. The words on the screen clearly stated that this box belonged to a funeral order. Cassie stood motionless in the cold room, the freezer compressor humming behind her, and the chill spreading through her body no longer came from the temperature in the room. A box meant for a funeral, brought into a wedding under a false vendor code, through a last-minute change ordered by the bride herself and the man named Elias Vance. She thought of the way Bianca had calmly ordered them to violate the forbidden list, of the way Elias had photographed the ceremonial table from several angles, of the way that powerful man had stopped anyone from placing even a vase of flowers on that very table. Every piece was fitting together into a shape Cassie couldn't yet see clearly. But she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't a warehouse mistake. Someone had deliberately taken an item from a funeral and brought it into the wedding of a man the whole city feared. She turned the box over in her hands, her fingers tracing the edge of the velvet, and she realized the bottom lining was thicker than normal, as though something else were hidden beneath it. Cassie glanced toward the storage room door. The hallway outside was dark and empty, with only the buzz of the fluorescent light at the far end. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She knew that if anyone caught her standing here, inside the cold room, holding the item someone had tried to hide, then with this family, the explanation of a server wouldn't be worth anything. But she also knew that if she set the box down and walked away now, she would never forgive herself. Cassie took a deep breath, placed the box on the shelf beneath the light, and began carefully searching for the edge of the bottom lining. The bottom lining of the box had been secured with a thin layer of glue, and Cassie had to use her fingernail to pry gently along the edge, while her other hand held the box firmly so it wouldn't slip. She worked slowly, carefully, the same way her hands always separated the most delicate layers of wrapping paper without tearing them, and after nearly 1 minute, the velvet lining loosened from the bottom. Beneath it, pressed flat against the inside of the box, was a small cream-colored card made of stiff paper, the kind funeral supply vendors still tucked into each item for internal notes. Cassie lifted it beneath the fluorescent light. One side of the card bore the order code and the vendor's logo, along with a product description in English clearly stating that this was a keepsake box. The kind families used to preserve small belongings of the dead, a lock of hair, a bracelet, a photograph. But it was the back of the card that made Cassie's breath catch. There, handwritten in black ink, neat and clear, was one short line. Memorial keepsake box, do not let the groom see. Cassie read that line 3 times, and each time she read it, the cold room around her seemed to shrink a little more. This wasn't a mistake. No warehouse mistake came with a handwritten instruction to hide an item from the eyes of one specific person. Someone knew exactly what this box was, knew it had originally been made to hold the grief of a family that had lost someone. And someone had deliberately brought it into a wedding, turning something sacred and private into a prop for a ceremony, while clearly instructing that the man who was about to place a ring inside it must never know the truth. Cassie sat down on the metal stool in the corner of the room, the card trembling slightly between 2 of her fingers. She thought about everything she had pieced together over the past several days. The 3 red lines forbidding things far too specific to be simple preferences, the way that powerful man had guarded the ceremonial table as though guarding a wound, the way Bianca had calmly ordered the violation of the very thing that had been forbidden, the way Elias Vance had arranged for the box to slip in without inspection. Now she understood that those forbidden things weren't event rules, but things that had once broken someone's heart, and someone was deliberately gathering them together, one by one, to place them directly in the middle of that man's most important day. She didn't know who the child from the funeral had been. She didn't know why someone would want to do something so cruel to the very person she was about to marry. But she knew one thing, clear and sharp as a blade, that this handwritten line wasn't meant to protect a harmless secret. It was a weapon, hidden beneath blue velvet, aimed straight at the softest place inside a human being. Cassie thought of her mother, of the tin box full of bills on top of the refrigerator, of the way people had treated her mother like a number while she lay in a hospital bed, and a quiet anger rose inside her, the kind of anger that only comes to those who have seen someone's pain treated as worthless with their own eyes. She could put the card back, glue the lining into place, lock the storage room door, and walk out. Tomorrow morning she would serve the wedding, collect the money that could save her whole family, and no one would ever know what she had seen tonight. That was the safe choice, the wise choice, the choice anyone in her position should make. But Cassie sat still in the cold room, staring at the black words on the cream-colored card, and she knew there were some things that, once seen, couldn't be pretended away. The question was no longer what she had discovered. The question now was what she would do with it, and how much she was willing to pay for her answer. Cassie photographed both sides of the card with her phone, then placed it back exactly where it had been beneath the lining, pressed the velvet back into place, and set the box inside the container, precisely the way she had found it, because instinct told her that if anyone discovered the item had been disturbed before the ceremony, the plan would simply be shifted onto another path she wouldn't be able to see. She locked the storage room, returned the key, and took 2 buses home through the city's cold near midnight, but the entire way, she saw nothing except the black handwriting on that cream-colored card. When she reached the apartment, she stood silently for a while outside Toby's bedroom door, listening to his steady breathing through the thin wall, then sat down on the worn sofa and let the real struggle begin. She knew exactly what speaking up would cost. If she said something, she would lose the contract, lose the chance of being kept on as a permanent employee. And the money that could save her whole family would vanish the moment she opened her mouth. Worse than that, she would be standing against a family whose name made the whole city lower its voice. A world where a nameless server could disappear and no one would care enough to ask. She had Toby. She was all the boy had left in the world. If something happened to her, who would sit on the edge of his bed at 2 o'clock in the morning, who would count every dose left in his inhaler, who would remind him to breathe out first and then breathe in. Reason told her the only wise thing was to stay silent, finish serving the wedding, take the money, and walk away as though she had never seen anything. But every time she almost managed to convince herself, a memory rose up, one she had buried very deep for the past 2 years. She remembered the hospital room, where her mother had lain during her final weeks, remembered the way the staff passed by her door more quickly and spoke to her less after the file showed that Cassie's family could no longer afford the new rounds of treatment. She remembered standing at the reception desk, 25 years old, trembling as she begged for more time. One more option, anything at all, and she remembered the tired eyes of the person behind the desk, looking at her as though she were looking at a number that had run out of value. She remembered her mother, the woman who had worked 2 jobs alone to raise the 2 of them, who had taught her that the way people treated you when they thought you didn't matter was who they really were, lying there in the silence of people who had decided that the pain of a poor person wasn't worth anyone stopping for. No one in that room had done anything wrong by the rules, but no one looked at her mother as a human being until the very end, and Cassie, sitting on the worn sofa in the dark apartment, understood that this was exactly what was happening again right before her eyes, only this time it was dressed in blue velvet and crystal chandelier light. Someone had decided that another human being's pain, no matter how powerful that person might be, could still be dragged out, used, turned into a weapon for someone else's purpose, and that he didn't even deserve to know it was happening to him. Cassie didn't know the man in the black coat. She didn't owe him anything. He was the kind of man she should have stayed farthest away from. But she had seen a person's pain treated as worthless once before, and in that hospital room, she had sworn that if she lived, she would never again stand silent in a room where that happened. She looked down at her hands, the calloused fingers from carrying trays, the hands that had held her mother's hand tightly in her final hours and rubbed Toby's back through his asthma attacks at midnight. And she realized that dignity wasn't something reserved only for people who had enough money to buy it. By the time it was nearly dawn, Cassie was no longer torn. She didn't know how she would do it, or when, or whether she would survive walking out of it. But she knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't let that wedding take place with that box sitting in the middle of the lobby, as though not one of those 300 people was decent enough to see the truth. Tomorrow she would be the one who saw. On the morning of the wedding, Cassie took Toby to the apartment of a trusted neighbor at the end of the hall, an elderly woman named Doreen, who sometimes watched him for her, and she held the boy a little longer than usual before leaving, long enough for Toby to look up and ask if she was okay. Cassie only smiled, stroked his hair, and said she was just going to work and would be home tonight. But as she walked down the stairs, she wasn't sure whether that promise was something she had the right to make. She arrived at the Driscoll Hotel early, wearing her black uniform, and from the moment she stepped into the kitchen, she could feel that the air of the entire building was pulled tight like a string wound too far. Today everything was more servers, more silent men standing in the corners, more lights, and a heavy solemnity so dense that even the clatter of knives and forks in the kitchen sounded like metal being pressed under weight. Cassie took her service area along the east wall, exactly where she had practiced during rehearsal, and from there she could see across the entire main lobby, including the ceremonial table set in the center of the aisle. She worked steadily, pouring water, arranging glasses, moving softly and invisibly exactly as people expected. But beneath that calm surface, every one of her senses was fixed on a single point. She watched Elias Vance appear in the middle of the morning, gray suit, slow steps, and she saw him personally supervise as 3 unmarked boxes were carried out of the auxiliary storage room and placed in a small waiting room behind the lobby, where the ceremonial props were prepared before the ceremony. Cassie's heart beat faster. She knew the blue velvet box was inside one of those 3 boxes, and she knew that at the exact moment of the ring exchange, it would be brought into the middle of the lobby, placed into the hands of the bride and groom before the eyes of 300 people, and not one of them would know what was hidden beneath the velvet. She had photographed the card, but she understood that a picture on a server's phone wouldn't carry any weight in this room, where power could make every piece of evidence disappear before anyone had time to see it. The only thing that couldn't be denied was the box itself, with the real card lying beneath the bottom, held up at the moment when everyone was watching. That meant she couldn't act too early, while a box was still sitting inside the container, and she couldn't act too late. After the ring had been placed inside and the ceremony had passed, she had only one moment, the moment when the box was brought into the light and handed over, and she had to choose it exactly. Cassie kept working, but her eyes never left the door of the waiting room behind the lobby. She saw Bianca appear in a white silk wedding gown, radiant and cold-edged, moving around to greet the guests, with a smile that never reached her eyes. She saw the man in the black coat enter and stand on the other side of the aisle, quiet as always, with two large men standing behind him. Cassie looked at him for an instant, the man who was about to place a ring inside a box, made to hold the keepsakes of the dead without knowing it, and she felt sweat dampen her palms. The music began to rise, a gentle piece played by the string quartet, and the guests took their seats one by one. A server appointed by Elias carried a small tray covered in velvet out from the waiting room, and on that tray, resting neatly beneath the crystal chandelier light, was the blue velvet ring box. Cassie set the water pitcher in her hand down on the side table, very gently, and took one step away from the east wall. Her heart slowed in a strange way, with the same cold calm she had felt in the hospital room 2 years earlier, when she understood that if she didn't speak, no one else would. The tray moved closer and closer toward the ceremonial table in the center of the lobby. The bride reached out to accept the box, and Cassie began walking toward the central aisle. Before the bride could close her fingers around it, Cassie lunged forward and snatched the blue velvet box straight from the tray. 300 guests turned to stare as she slammed the box against the marble ceremonial table, shattering its delicate frame. Bianca's sharp laugh cut through the sudden silence of the string quartet, mocking her, but Cassie didn't give the box back. Instead, her raw knuckles tore open the loose velvet lining, pulling out the cream-colored internal order card and lifting it high enough for the groom to see. "This isn't a ring box," she cried out, her voice steady in the silence. "This came from a child's memorial order, and the person who chose it knew exactly whose child it was." At the moment the card was held high and Cassie's words were still hanging suspended in the air, the entire lobby seemed frozen between one breath and the next. Then the silence shattered. One of the two large men standing behind the man in the black coat, a man named Frankie Dorr with broad shoulders and the flat expression of someone used to solving problems with his hands, immediately stepped forward, his hand moving inside his suit jacket, and for 1 second, Cassie was certain this was the final moment of her life. She didn't step back. She stood still in the middle of the aisle, the card still raised high, her eyes never leaving the man she had just spoken to directly. But Frankie couldn't take another step, because the man in the black coat lifted one hand, only one hand, without turning his head, without saying a word, and that small gesture was enough to stop the bodyguard in place, as though he had just slammed into an invisible wall. The whole room understood that the real power in this lobby did not lie in the hand slipping beneath that suit jacket, but in the man who had just raised his hand. Whispers began spreading through the 300 guests, first as soft as leaves, then growing into a wave of restrained panic. A few people rose from their chairs. A woman in the front row lifted a hand to cover her mouth. The string quartet had stopped completely at some point, and the musicians sat motionless, their bows still suspended above the strings. Bianca was the next to react. The bride's face, radiant only a few seconds earlier, now turned pale, then flushed red, and she let out a short, shrill laugh, trying to seize back the control that was slipping from her hands. "This girl is insane," she said loudly, her voice rising to drown out the whispers. "A common little server. She must be drunk, or someone paid her to come ruin our wedding. Someone get her out of here right now." But no one moved because the man in the black coat still had not lowered his hand, and as long as he had not given an order, no one in that room dared decide for him. Bianca turned to him, and for the first time Cassie saw a crack in her cold sharpness, an undisguised urgency as she stepped closer and placed her hand on her fiancé's arm. "Don't listen to her," she said, her voice forcing itself into softness. "Today is our day. Don't let some madwoman ruin everything." The man did not look at her. He did not look at the 300 guests, did not look at the bodyguard still rooted in place, did not even look at Bianca clinging to his sleeve. He looked only at Cassie, and that gaze did not carry the rage she had prepared herself to receive, nor the contempt she was used to seeing in the eyes of powerful people when they looked at a server. That gaze carried something else, a cold and deep focus, as though in a room of 300 people, she was the only thing he could see. He stepped toward her, slowly, and the crowd automatically widened to make way for him, just like the invisible space Cassie had noticed during the rehearsal. He stopped 1 foot away from her, looked at the card in her hand, then looked back at her face, and when he spoke, his voice was low enough that only she could hear. "Come with me," he said. Bianca immediately protested, her voice rising almost into a scream, as she said that he couldn't abandon the ceremony halfway through because of the words of a serving girl, that all the guests were watching, that he was humiliating both families. He turned to her only once and said, in a calm, deep voice more frightening than any shout, that she would stay right here and would not leave this room. Then he signaled for Frankie and the other bodyguard to watch the lobby, and he led Cassie through 300 silent stairs toward a dark wooden door at the end of the hall. Cassie followed him, the card still clenched tightly in her hand, her heart pounding, and she knew that whatever was waiting behind that door, there was no way back now. The room behind the dark wooden door was a private study, with dark paneled walls, a large desk, and 2 lamps casting a deep golden light, soundproofed so completely that when the door closed, the whispers of 300 guests vanished as though they had been cut off with a knife. The man walked behind the desk, turned to face her, and in that closed space, with no crowd and no chandelier light, the danger radiating from him became sharper and closer. "Put it on the desk," he said, his eyes on the card. Cassie didn't put it down. She held it in her hand and looked straight at him. "If I put it down, you can take it and burn it, and then no one will know the truth," she said, her voice steadier than even she had expected. "I've come this far. I won't hand over the only thing that proves what I said." A silence stretched between them. He looked at her as though he were reconsidering everything he thought he knew about people who wore black uniforms and carried trays of wine. "Do you know what you just did?" he said, his voice low and even. "You stood in front of 300 people and called my wedding a fraud. People have died for doing far less than that." "I know," Cassie answered, and this time her voice trembled slightly, but she didn't step back. "I know who you are. I know staying home tonight was the only safe thing I should have done. I have a 9-year-old brother and a stack of bills that the money from this wedding could pay. I have every reason in the world to stay silent." "Then why?" he asked, and for the first time something else slipped into his voice, a curiosity that even he seemed not to have expected. Cassie set the card on the desk, but kept 1 finger pressed against it. "Because I saw where this was hidden and how it was hidden," she said. "This box didn't come from a wedding. It was taken from a funeral order, switched through a false vendor at the last minute so no one would inspect it, and beneath its bottom there's a handwritten line saying the groom absolutely must not be allowed to see it." She stopped and looked into his eyes. "People don't give instructions to hide something from one specific person unless that thing is aimed straight at him." He stood very still. "How did you know to look?" he asked. "You're a server." Cassie lifted her head. "Yes, I'm a server," she said, "and that's exactly why I see things the people sitting at the tables never see. When people think you're invisible, they forget to hide. I've carried trays through hundreds of parties, and I've learned that a dining table never lies. A forbidden list of things too specific to be preferences. A bride calmly ordering people to violate the very thing forbidden. A man arranging for an item to slip in without inspection. Piece by piece, they're harmless, but put together, they tell a story, and that story isn't a wedding." He turned away, walked to the window, and for a long while he said nothing. Cassie looked at his back, at the way his shoulders, always straight and solid as stone, now seemed to sink slightly beneath the weight of something she didn't yet fully understand. When he turned back, his face was cold, but his eyes had changed, as though some door locked shut for a very long time had opened by a narrow crack. "The things on that list," he said, his voice roughened, "they aren't my preferences. They're things I don't allow to exist in my life because every one of them is tied to someone I lost. And someone gathered all of them together, one by one, to put them into today." Cassie said nothing. She understood this wasn't the time to speak. He looked at her, and this time his gaze was no longer the gaze of a boss interrogating a server, but the gaze of a human being who had just realized that for a long time, his most private pain had been silently touched, shaped, and used by someone else's hand. "You're the first person," he said slowly, "in 2 years to look directly at it and tell me, instead of using it or pretending it doesn't exist." In the silence between them, there was a new and difficult tension to name. Not hostility, not fear, but a recognition between two people who should never have been standing in the same room. Then he asked, so softly it was almost only a breath, "Do you know who the child on that card was?" Cassie shook her head, and he closed his eyes for a moment, as if preparing to say a name he hadn't been able to speak aloud for 2 years. Before he could say the name, the dark wooden door opened, and an older man stepped in, silver hair neatly combed, moving with the bearing of someone who had stood beside power long enough to no longer fear it. Cassie recognized him as the only person over the past several days whom the silent men in the corners treated with real respect rather than fear. His name was Renzo, and he was the family's longtime advisor. The man Cassie would later learn had been beside the man in the black coat since before he took power. Renzo looked at the card on the desk, then at the stunned face of the man he had served all his life, and something in his eyes sagged as though he had been waiting for and dreading this moment for a very long time. "I heard what happened in the lobby," Renzo said quietly. "Tommaso, there are things you need to know, and I've kept them for too long." That was the first time Cassie heard his name, Tommaso, and she saw that powerful man shudder slightly when the name Mara was spoken by Renzo right after it. Renzo told the story, his voice steady and heavy, that the death of Mara, Tommaso's 6-year-old daughter 2 years ago, had never been as simple as what people had told him. They had said it was an accident, a car losing control on a rainy afternoon, a blind misfortune no one could have prevented. But Renzo said there were details that had never fit, that the driver that day had been changed at the last minute, that the route had been altered by someone who knew the family's habits well, and that those things couldn't have happened without someone on the inside, someone the family trusted, arranging them in advance. Tommaso stood frozen, and Cassie witnessed something perhaps very few people had ever been allowed to see, the quiet collapse of a man the entire city believed could not be wounded. He braced one hand on the desk as though his legs could no longer hold him, and when he spoke, his voice was no longer the voice of a boss, but the voice of a father. She was about to turn 7, he said, almost to himself. Her last birthday, she asked for a tiered cake so tall she had to stand on tiptoe to reach the top layer, and she laughed through that whole afternoon. She loved a song, he went on, and Cassie saw his eyes glisten with a wetness he fought to hold back, an old piano piece, Claire de Lune. She made me play it over and over until I knew every note by heart. After she died, I couldn't listen to that music again, couldn't look at a tiered cake, couldn't bear the color blue, her favorite color, the blue of the box that held the little things of hers I still kept. Cassie felt her chest tighten, because she had just understood everything. The 3 red lines in the packet hadn't been senseless prohibitions. No tiered wedding cake, no blue velvet ring box, no Claire de Lune. Those were exactly the 3 things tied to the final birthday of a 6-year-old girl. 3 things that had been listed not to honor a father's grief, but so someone would know exactly where to touch in order to break his heart. And the funeral box hidden beneath the blue velvet, with the note instructing that the groom must not see it, was the final and cruelest piece in a plan that wasn't only aimed at Tommaso's heart, but was also deliberately mocking the very memory of the child he had lost. Renzo looked at him, then at Cassie, and said that the fact those 3 absolutely confidential prohibitions had been known in such exact detail, then recreated precisely on the wedding day, couldn't be coincidence, and could only have come from someone very close, someone inside the innermost circle of trust. Tommaso lifted his head, and this time there was no longer only pain in his eyes, but something cold and sharp beginning to form, the look of a man who had just realized that the person who had been touching his wound for the past 2 years might be standing right on the other side of the door, in a white silk wedding dress. But he still didn't say her name. He turned to Cassie and asked, in a hoarse voice, whether she was willing to tell him, from the beginning, everything she had seen. Before Cassie could begin telling the story from the start, the door opened again, this time without a knock, and Bianca stepped in with 2 of her own men behind her, men who did not belong to the Falconetti family, but wore the discreet insignia of the Coletti house. If a few minutes earlier she had seemed panicked in the lobby, now she had recovered her familiar cold sharpness, and Cassie understood that the brief time outside had been enough for Bianca to make a few phone calls and prepare a counterattack. She didn't look at Tommaso first. She looked straight at Cassie, and her smile widened coldly. "You're going to believe a girl like this," she said, her voice sweet and filled with false sympathy. Before you listen to one more word from her, you should know who she is." She snapped her fingers, and one of her men handed her a stack of papers, which she dropped onto the desk in front of Tommaso. "Cassie Holloway." She read aloud, 27 years old, $41,000 in medical debt, laid on rent 3 times this year, a temporary server earning wages she can't live on. "A person desperate for money," she said. Exactly the kind of person someone could easily hire to stage a scene that destroys a wedding. She had dug into Cassie's private life in only a few minutes, and the fact that she could do it that quickly chilled Cassie more than any threat. But what truly froze the blood in her veins was the next sentence. She mentioned Toby. She said the boy's name, his age, even the fact that he had asthma, and said it was such a pity for a sick child, when his only sister had gotten herself into trouble serious enough to be arrested for stealing property at a private event. She turned to one of her men and said the props in storage had been disturbed, that a server had stayed alone in the storage area the night before, and that the cameras would certainly show it. She was weaving a story right before their eyes, turning Cassie's search for the truth into evidence against her, and she did it so smoothly that Cassie understood this wasn't the first time she had staged a person's downfall. In that moment, every instinct of self-preservation inside Cassie screamed for her to lower her head, to apologize, to admit she had been mistaken in order to protect Toby. But she thought of the hospital room, of the way people had looked at her mother like a number, and she knew that if she stepped back now, she wouldn't only betray herself, she would betray the man standing here with his heart freshly torn open. She lifted her head and her voice rang clear in the closed room. "You're right," she said to Bianca. "I owe $41,000. I'm behind on rent. I'm so poor that the money from this wedding could change my entire life." She turned to Tommaso. "And that's exactly why you should believe me. A person as desperate for money as I am, who still gives up all that money to tell the truth, is either the stupidest person in the city, or she's telling the truth. No one hired me. I don't know anyone here. I'm just the only person among the 300 people out there who is willing to look beneath the bottom of a box." She pointed to the card on the desk. "The storage camera will show me opening that box, but it will also show me putting it back exactly as it was, because I didn't go there to steal. I went there to know. And if you're so confident the cameras can convict me, then show all of it here, including the footage of who ordered the vendor changed at the last minute." The silence after those words was so thick that Cassie could hear her own heartbeat. Bianca was no longer smiling. She looked at Cassie with something new in her eyes, no longer the contempt reserved for a server, but the cold wariness of someone who had just realized her opponent refused to fall. And Tommaso, standing silent between the two women, slowly reached out and picked up the papers about Cassie, glanced over them once, then set them down and looked at Bianca with a gaze that seemed to lower the temperature of the entire room by several degrees. Tommaso set the stack of papers down on the desk and looked at Bianca for a long time, and in that silence, Cassie felt the weight of the choice pressing down on this man. She understood, if only dimly, that this marriage wasn't simply a wedding, but an alliance between two families, and that breaking it apart halfway through meant lighting the fuse on consequences she couldn't even imagine. A man in his position, with his power, could choose the simplest path, order his people to deal with the troublesome server, smother every rumor, continue the ceremony, and preserve the alliance. That was the path Cassie had prepared herself to face since the night before. But Tommaso didn't choose that path. When he spoke, his voice was deep and slow, and the first thing he said wasn't an order for blood but a question. He turned to Renzo and told him to call the hotel security manager and have the full camera data from the auxiliary storage area from the previous night brought up here, uncut, unedited, original. Bianca immediately objected, saying there was no need to make a spectacle, that he was letting a server control him. But Tommaso raised his hand, the same gesture that had stopped the bodyguard cold in the lobby, and she fell silent. He said that if Cassie was lying, the camera would prove it, and he would personally hand her over for Bianca to deal with. But if Cassie was telling the truth, that same camera would show who truly needed to answer. Cassie realized he was doing something she hadn't expected from a man like him. He was choosing evidence over instinct, truth over blood. While they waited for the data to be brought up, he asked Renzo to contact the original prop vendor, the company Halcyon had used for many years, and the one Elias Vance had pushed aside at the last minute, to to verify whether they had ever received an order to provide the blue velvet box. He also asked them to trace the order code printed on the card, the code Cassie had scanned in the storage room, to find out whose name the funeral box had originally been ordered under and what account had paid for it. Every step he laid out was cold, methodical, and Cassie understood that she was witnessing a man accustomed to using power to impose his will now forcing himself to use power to uncover a truth he was afraid to face. Bianca tried again, this time changing her tone, soft and wounded, saying that he was breaking her heart by suspecting her on their wedding day, that she had loved him, chosen him, stood beside him through the hardest years after he lost his child. And it was that final sentence, the way she invoked Mara like a card meant to draw pity, that made Tommaso's face close off completely. Cassie saw something freeze in his eyes, because he had just realized that even in this moment, the woman before him was still using the pain of his daughter's death as a tool, exactly the way someone had been using it for the past 2 years. He looked at her and said, very quietly, that if she had truly stood beside him after he lost his child, she would never have allowed the 3 things his little girl loved most to appear in this room. Bianca opened her mouth to answer, but no words came in time, because at that very moment the security manager knocked and stepped inside, carrying a tablet that held the complete camera data from the previous night. Tommaso turned to Cassie, and this time there was something in his eyes that had not appeared since the confrontation began, a cautious trust, but a real one. He asked whether she was willing to stand there and watch it with him, and Cassie, though she knew the footage could also become the thing that condemned her, nodded. She had chosen to speak the truth. Now she would stand in place and let the truth speak for itself. The footage appeared on the tablet screen with a clarity that chilled the blood. It showed Cassie entering the auxiliary storage room with the scanner in her hand, opening the box, picking up the blue velvet ring box, turning it over to find the barcode, then placing it back exactly where it had been before leaving, just as she had said, with not a single item taken. But the footage didn't stop there. Tommaso ordered it rewound to several hours earlier, and another image appeared on the screen. Elias Vance personally entering the auxiliary storage room while it was still daylight, carrying 3 unmarked boxes, placing the blue velvet box inside one of them, and applying the false vendor label to the box with his own hands. He had no idea he was being recorded, because he had believed the auxiliary storage area was outside camera range. But the security manager explained that the hotel had installed a new camera eye in the ceiling corner only a few weeks before. Tommaso had Elias Vance summoned to the study, and when he stepped inside, the false calm of an event manager had vanished, replaced by the pale face of a man who had just understood that he had been exposed. He tried to deny it, saying he had only followed the organizer's instructions, but Tommaso placed the card and the footage side by side on the desk, and his silence was deeper and heavier than any threat. Renzo stepped closer to Elias and said quietly that the original vendor had just confirmed over the phone that they had never received an order for that box, and that the order code on the card had been traced back to a payment account under the name of a shell company, a company whose records showed a direct connection to the Coletti house. The name Coletti rang through the closed room like a stone dropping onto still water, and Cassie saw Bianca, for the first time, truly falter. Elias Vance, knowing he had no way out, and that standing with the Coletti house now would only leave him carrying the full blame for them, began to speak, and the words he uttered tore away the final covering from the tragedy. He said Mara's death 2 years ago had never been an accident. He said the driver switch and the route change on that rainy afternoon had been arranged by people from the Coletti house, as a warning strike in the struggle for control of the docks, a blow that was supposed only to send a message but had slipped beyond control and taken the life of a child. He said the Coletti house, after causing that death, had not taken responsibility, but had instead turned it into a tool, and then he looked at Bianca and said the most terrible thing of all, that Bianca had known from the beginning that her family was behind Mara's death, and that she had used that information, used Tommaso's pain and vague suspicion, to work her way into his life, standing beside him precisely when he was at his weakest, guiding him toward a marriage alliance that benefited the Coletti house, while burying forever the truth about who had truly killed his daughter. The blue velvet box, the funeral card, the 3 forbidden things brought back to life, all of it wasn't only senseless cruelty, but Bianca's quiet display of power, a way of reminding herself that she held this man's grief in the palm of her hand and could touch it whenever she wanted. She had been too confident, too used to no one daring to look beneath the bottom of a box, to imagine that the only person who would see it would be a server she had once mocked. Tommaso stood there, and the entire room held its breath, waiting for the fury of a boss who had just learned that the person who killed his child had been standing beside him for 2 years beneath the disguise of a lover. But he didn't roar. He didn't order bloodshed. He only turned to look at Bianca, and in his eyes was a cold pain more frightening than any rage. The pain of a man who had just understood that for the past 2 years he had let his daughter's killer sit at his table, speak the little girl's name in a voice of false sympathy, and he had nearly handed the rest of his life to her, instead of handling everything in the shadows of the study. Tommaso did something Cassie hadn't expected. He chose to bring the truth into the light. He ordered his men to invite the key figures of both families into a small banquet room, separate from the main lobby, where 300 guests were still sitting in confusion, and he had the head of the Coletti house summoned as well, Bianca's father, an older man with silver hair and eyes accustomed to giving orders, a man who had come to the wedding with the certainty of someone about to witness an alliance being sealed. When everyone had gathered, Tommaso didn't raise his voice. He placed 3 things on the table: the funeral card with the handwritten line, the footage of Elias Vance bringing the box into storage, and the order code trace leading back to the Coletti house's shell company. Then he let Renzo speak. The old advisor stood, and Cassie realized this was the moment he had been waiting for and dreading for 2 years. Renzo admitted before both families that he had suspected something about Mara's death from the very beginning, that he had collected unusual details about the driver switch and the route change, but he had chosen silence because he feared speaking up would ignite a war between the 2 families and spill blood across the city. He said that silence was the greatest sin of his life, that he had allowed fear of war to cloud his duty to the child he had once held in his arms, and that now, when the truth had been exposed by an outsider, he couldn't continue being a coward for even 1 more day. He confirmed each piece of evidence one by one, and his testimony, coming from a man respected by both families, carried a weight no one in the room could deny. Bianca's father sat listening, his face shifting from anger to stunned disbelief, and Cassie understood that there were things even the head of the Coletti house had never known. He hadn't known his daughter had used Mara's death this way. He hadn't known Bianca had turned a crime he may once have wanted buried into a personal stepping stone to climb into the center of power inside the rival family. And when he looked at his daughter, his eyes were no longer the eyes of a father protecting his child, but the eyes of a man who had just realized his daughter had pushed the entire family into a position with no way back. Because the truth was now on the table, in front of the most powerful witnesses, and if the Coletti house tried to protect Bianca, they would be accepting responsibility for both the death of a child and the conspiracy to manipulate another family, a burden strong enough to destroy their position. In the world they lived in, some things were worth more than blood ties, and the survival of an entire bloodline was one of them. Bianca's father stood, and in a voice heavy as stone, he declared before everyone that the Coletti house had not known about and did not condone what his daughter had done, that she had acted alone, and that from this moment forward, she no longer had the protection of the family. It was a cold and ruthless abandonment, but in the underworld it was also the only way a family could save itself. Bianca, who only hours earlier had been the radiant bride before 300 guests, now stood alone in the room, stripped of every power that had once made her frightening, abandoned by her own father, and exposed before the very people she had believed she could control. Tommaso looked at her one last time, and there was no gunshot, no fist, no bloodshed of the kind his world had always known. He only said she would answer to both the law and the laws of this world, that the evidence about Mara's death would be given to those who needed to receive it, and that from this moment on, she would never again be allowed anywhere near his daughter's memory. Cassie stood in the corner of the room, witnessing it all, and she understood that she had just seen something rare, a powerful man choosing truth as his weapon instead of blood, and letting justice, not rage, decide the fate of the person who had destroyed his life. In the weeks after the day the wedding fell apart, The truth about Mara's death was handed over to the authorities for investigation, and the evidence Cassie had uncovered became the foundation of a case that had once seemed forever closed under the word accident. Elias Vance, facing the possibility of taking the full blame for the Coletti house, chose to cooperate with investigators in exchange for leniency, and his testimony pulled in an entire chain of people who had taken part in the cover-up. Bianca, with no family left behind her, no one left to manipulate, had to face both the legal system and the abandonment of the very world whose summit she had once longed to climb. Cassie did not witness the end of those proceedings, because she did not belong to that world, but she knew that for the first time in 2 years, Mara's name was being spoken not as a tool, but as a person, a child who deserved to have justice claimed back for her. A few days later, Tommaso came to the apartment on the south side. His presence in that narrow hallway with the brown stain on the ceiling seemed to make the whole space sink under its weight. But he brought no bodyguards, brought none of the authority of a boss, only an envelope that he placed on the old kitchen table. He said it was the payment for her mother's entire hospital debt, $41,000, now fully settled, and that she no longer had to open the tin box on top of the refrigerator with trembling hands. Cassie looked at the envelope for a long time, then pushed it back toward him. "I didn't speak up to be paid," she said, her voice calm but firm. "If I accept this, then everything I did that night becomes a transaction, and it wasn't that." A silence passed between them, and Cassie saw in Tommaso's eyes surprise first, then a kind of respect she had never seen him give anyone. He did not put the envelope away immediately. He sat down in the chair across from her, and this time he spoke more slowly, not in the voice of a man granting a favor, but in the voice of someone learning how to speak like an ordinary human being. He said he understood, that he wasn't trying to buy her silence or her gratitude, because neither of those things had ever been for sale. But he said there was a difference between paying someone for something they had done and lifting a burden no one should ever have had to carry alone. "Your mother was treated like a number," he said, "and you were the one who refused to let another human being be treated the same way." He told her he did not want her to accept the money as a reward, but to let him do what an entire system should have done for her mother from the beginning, to treat the pain of a poor family with the seriousness it deserved. Cassie stayed silent for a very long time, and she understood that he wasn't diminishing her. He was giving her a choice rather than offering her charity. At last, she said she would accept only if it was an interest-free loan that she would repay little by little in her own way, and Tommaso, after a moment, nodded, because he had begun to understand that with this woman, dignity was not something to be negotiated, but something to be respected. Toby appeared in the doorway of the bedroom, curiously looking at the tall stranger sitting in his kitchen, and Tommaso, the man the whole city feared, suddenly became strangely awkward beneath the clear gaze of a 9-year-old child. He asked the boy a few simple questions about school, about the inhaler he held in his hand, and Cassie saw something in him soften as he looked at the child, an old and aching tenderness he had thought he had buried with his daughter. In the weeks that followed, Toby was examined by a skilled specialist, given the proper medication, and for the first time in a very long while, the asthma attacks at midnight grew less frequent, and Cassie no longer had to count every dose left in the inhaler with constant fear. The apartment was still old, the stain on the ceiling was still there, but for the first time in 2 years, Cassie slept through an entire night. The months that followed passed slowly. In a rhythm neither Cassie nor Tommaso tried to rush. He did not appear like a man used to getting whatever he wanted, but like someone learning from the beginning how to enter another person's life. The first time he invited her to dinner, he did not order a restaurant to reserve a table, did not send a car for her as though collecting a possession, but simply asked whether she wanted to go, and if she was busy with Toby, he would wait for another time. That word, ask, seemed small, but Cassie understood how enormous it was for someone like him, a man before whose every wish the world had grown used to bowing. Maggie, when she heard Cassie tell the story, widened her eyes and said she wasn't sure whether she should be happy or afraid. But then even Maggie had to admit that the man who showed up at the shop door to pick up her friend with a bouquet held a little awkwardly did not look like the boss the whole city whispered about. Tommaso learned to ask first in the smallest things. He asked before sitting down. He asked before mentioning Toby. He asked once, in a voice rarely so hesitant, whether he was allowed to tell her about Mara, and when Cassie nodded, he spoke of his daughter for the first time, not as a wound someone else had pried open, but as a memory he had chosen for himself to bring into the light. He told her about the little girl's laughter, about the way she made him read the same storybook again and again, about the afternoon she stood on tiptoe to reach the highest layer of the cake. And Cassie realized that this was the very difference she had sensed dimly from that closed room on the wedding day, the difference between someone using his pain as a chain and someone allowing him to hold that pain himself in his own way. As for Cassie, for the first time in many years, she allowed herself to think about something beyond survival. The hospital debt no longer hung over her head. Toby's asthma attacks had grown less frequent, and in that new space to breathe, an old dream she had thought was dead began stirring again. She had once trained as a baker before everything fell apart, once dreamed of having a small bakery of her own, and now she began baking again. At first just a few cakes and pastries for Toby and Maggie, then for the neighbors, then for small orders around the neighborhood. Tommaso never once offered to buy her a bakery, though for him it would have been as easy as turning over his hand, because he had understood that doing so would take from her the very thing she was trying to reclaim, the feeling of building something by herself, with her own calloused hands. Instead, he asked what she needed, and listened, and helped only in the ways she allowed. The relationship between them grew slowly, full of cautious spaces, because both of them carried wounds that had not fully healed. There were nights when Cass still wondered whether a poor server and a man from a world filled with shadows could truly belong to each other. And there were times when Tommaso still fell silent in the middle of a conversation, when a memory of his daughter came rushing back. But they did not hurry to cover those wounds with easy promises. They let everything unfold the way a real wound heals, slowly, sometimes painfully, but honestly. One evening, as Tommaso stood in her small kitchen watching her knead dough, he said it had been a very long time since he had seen a home that smelled of something being created, instead of something being guarded. Cassie looked up at him, her hands still dusted with flour, and in that moment between them there was no possession, no power, no fear, only two people whose pain had once been treated as worthless by life, now learning how to give each other the most precious thing both of them had once been denied: to be seen, and to be asked before being touched. 1 year after the day, the card was held up in the middle of the grand lobby of the Driscoll Hotel. On a quiet street not far from the South Side neighborhood where Cassie had grown up, a small bakery opened its doors with a simple wooden sign bearing the words Mara's Table. The name was not chosen by Tommaso, but offered by him with permission, and Cassie asked him again and again to make sure he truly wanted his daughter's name to live on, in a place filled with the scent of butter, sugar, and fresh flour, instead of being locked inside the pain of memory. He said that was exactly what he wanted, that the little girl had loved warm kitchens and towering cakes, and that there was no place more worthy of carrying her name. In the corner of the bakery, hanging on the wall beside the counter, the blue velvet keepsake box was now placed with honor inside a glass frame, and beside it, beneath the same glass, was the funeral card with the handwritten line that had once been used as a weapon. Cassie had chosen not to hide them away, but to display them, not to revive cruelty, but to remind everyone who walked in that there were things that small, a card, a box, a gaze willing to look down, that could change an entire life. On Mara's birthday that year, Cassie and Tommaso made a tiered cake together, the very kind of cake he had been unable to look at for 2 years, and they made it not in tears, but in a gentle peace, kneading dough while telling Toby about the little girl who used to stand on tiptoe to reach the highest layer. The old music Tommaso had once been afraid to hear played softly through the bakery, and this time it was no longer a wound, but a tender greeting sent to someone who was gone. Cassie looked at the man whose name the whole city had once spoken only in whispers, now carefully spreading frosting over one cake layer with an endearing awkwardness, looked at healthy Toby laughing beside him, looked at the blue box inside the glass frame, catching the afternoon sunlight, and she understood that pain never truly disappeared, but it could be placed somewhere worthy, somewhere it was honored instead of used, seen instead of hidden. This story, from beginning to end, was never only about a server and a boss. It was about the simple thing we so often forget, that a person's dignity is not measured by the money in their pocket or the position they hold, that the poorest person in the room is sometimes the only one brave enough to look straight at the truth, and that treating another person's pain with kindness, no matter who they are, is the true measure of the human heart. Cassie could have chosen silence to protect her own life, but she chose to speak, because she had once seen with her own eyes what happens when no one is willing to speak, and that choice did not only save one person, it also healed 2 broken hearts. If this story touched something in your heart, please subscribe to our channel. Press the like button and share this video so you can listen to many more meaningful and captivating stories every day. We would truly love to know how this story made you feel, whether it reminded you of a moment in your own life, a time when you chose to speak up, or a time when you wished you had. So please leave a comment below so we can hear the feelings from deep inside your heart. Thank you for taking the time to listen all the way to the very last moment, and we also wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life every day, and a peaceful soul. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.